And we're back with part 3 already of this week's reading of the Messianic Jewish Family Bible, Tree of Life version, TLV. And we're beginning with chapter 7, Scattering an Aramean Army. Then Elisha said, Hear the word of Adonai. Thus says Adonai, Tomorrow about this time a measure of fine flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. Then the officer on whose hand the king was leaning responded to the man of God and said, Look, even if Adonai should make windows in heaven, could this thing happen? He announced, Behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat any of it. Now there were 4 men with Zaarot, with leprosy, at the entrance of the gate, and they said to one another, Why should we sit here till we die? If we say, Let's go into the city, then the famine is in the city, so we will die there. But if we sit still here, we'll also die. So come, let's go into the camp of the Arameans. If they spare us, we'll live, and if they kill us, we'll just die. So they got up at twilight to go to the camp of the Arameans, but when they arrived at the edge of the Aramean camp, behold, no one was there. For Adonai had caused the army of the Arameans to hear a noise of chariots and a noise of horses, indeed a noise of a huge army. So they said one to another, Look, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to assault us. So they got up and fled at twilight, abandoning their tents, their horses, and their donkeys, their entire camp just as it was, and fled for their lives. When these men with Ze'erot came to the edge of the camp, they entered into one tent and ate and drank and took from there silver, gold, and clothes, then went and hid them. Then they returned and went into another tent and took from there too, and went and hid them. Then they said to each other, It's not right what we're doing. This day is a day of good news, and we're keeping silent. If we wait till morning light, punishment will overtake us. Let's go now and report to the king's household. So they came and called out to the city gatekeepers and told them, We went to the camp of the Arameans, and look, there was not a single soul there, no human voice, just the horses and the donkeys tied up, and the tents just as they were. Then the gatekeepers called out, and it was reported to the royal palace inside. When the king got up in the night, he said to his courtiers, Let me tell you now what the Arameans have contrived against us. They know that we are hungry, so they went out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, thinking, When they come out of the city, we'll capture them alive and get into the city. But one of his courtiers answered and said, Please let some men take 5 of the remaining horses left in the city. Look, they are just like the whole multitude left in it. And look, they will be just like the whole multitude of Israel that has already perished. So let's send and see. So they took 2 chariots and with horses, and the king sent them after the army of the Arameans, saying, Go and see. They went after them to the Jordan, and behold, all the way was strewn with clothes and equipment which the Arameans had thrown away in their haste. Then the messengers returned and reported to the king. So the people went out and ransacked the camp of the Arameans. Then a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, just as was the word of Adonai. Now the king appointed the officer of whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. But the people trampled on him at the gate, and he died, just as the man of God had said, who spoke when the king came down to him. For when the man of God had spoken to the king, 2 measures of barley for a shekel, and a measure of fine flour for a shekel will be tomorrow about this time at the gate of Samaria, that the officer had answered the man of God and said, Look, even if Adonai should make windows in heaven, could such a thing happen? And he replied, Behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but will not eat any of it, because he got trampled and died. That's what happened to him, for the people trampled on him at the gate, and he died. Chapter 8, the Shunammite's land restored. Now Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, Arise and go with your household and stay wherever you can, because Adonai has called for a famine. Indeed, it has already come on the land for 7 years. So the woman arose and did according to the word of the man of God. She and her household went and stayed in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. Now at the end of the 7 years, the woman returned to the land of the Philistines, returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went to the king to appeal for her house and her farm. Now the king was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God. Please tell me, he was saying, all the great things that Elisha has done. And it came to pass, just as he was telling the king how he had revived someone who was dead, behold, there was the woman whose son he had revived, appealing to the king for her house and her farm. So Gehazi said, my lord the king, this is the woman, and this is her son whom Elisha revived. When the king asked the woman, she told him the story. So the king assigned to her a court official, saying, restore all that was hers, and all the revenue of the field since the day that she left, and the land until now. Elisha weeps in Damascus. Then Elisha went to Damascus at the time King Benhadad of Aram was sick, and he was told, the man of God has come all the way here. So the king said to Hazael, take an offering in your hand and go meet the man of God, and inquire of Adonai by him, saying, will I recover from this illness? So Hazael went to meet him, and took an offering in his hand of every good thing of Damascus, 40 camel loads, then came and stood before him and said, your son Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to saying, will I recover from this illness? Elisha said to him, go say to him, you will surely recover. However, Adonai has also shown me that he will surely die. Then he fixed his gaze steadily on him until he was ashamed, and then the man of God wept. When Hazael asked him, why is my lord weeping? He answered, because I know the evil that you will inflict on the men of Israel. Their strongholds you will set on fire. Their young men you will slay with a sword. Their little ones you will dash into pieces, and their pregnant ones you will rip open. Then Hazael said, but what is your servant, who is but a dog, that he should do anything of such magnitude? Elisha answered, Adonai has shown me that you will be king over Aram. Then he departed from Elisha and went to his master, who asked him, what did Elisha say to you? He answered, he told me that you would surely recover. But the next day he took a thick cloth, soaked it in water, and spread it on his face so that he died. Then Hazael became king in his place. The last part is Edom revolts against Jehoram. Now in the 5th year of Jehoram, son of Ahab, the king of Israel. Let me try that again. Getting tongue-tied here. In the 5th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, Jehoshaphat had been king of Judah. Jehoram, the son of King Jehoshaphat, and we have Joram, son of Ahab. Jehoram, the son of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, became king. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. But he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab did. For Ahab's daughter was his wife, and he did what was evil in Adonai's eyes. Nevertheless, Adonai was not willing to destroy Judah for the sake of David, his servant, since he promised to give him a lamp for his children all days. In his days, Edom revolted from under the hand of Judah and set up their own king. Then Joram, Joram, crossed over to Zair with all his chariots. It came about that he rose by night and struck the Edomites who had surrounded him and the chariot commanders, but his troops fled to their tents. So Edom kept rebelling from under the hand of Judah to this day. Then Libnah also revolted at the same time. Now the rest of the acts of Joram and all that he did, are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Judah? Then Joram slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. Then his son Ahaziah became king in his place. In the 12th year of Joram, son of King Ahab of Israel, Ahaziah, son of King Jehoram of Judah, began to reign. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of King Omri of Israel. Now he walked in the way of the house of Ahab, and did what was evil in Adonai's eyes, as the house of Ahab had done, for he was a son-in-law of the house of Ahab. He marched with Joram, son of Ahab, to war against Hazael, king of Aram, at Ramoth Gilead, but the Arameans wounded Joram. So King Joram returned to Jezreel to recover from the wounds that the Arameans had inflicted on him at Ramah when he fought against King Hazael of Aram. Ahaziah, son of King Jehoram of Judah, went down to see Joram, son of Ahab, in Jezreel because he was sick. And that's the end of chapter 8. And we're going on to chapter 9. Jehu avenges Naboth. Then Elisha the prophet summoned one of the sons of the prophets and told him, "Strap up your cloak, take this flask of oil in your hand, and go to Ramoth Gilead. When you arrive there, look out there for Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi. Then go in, get him to rise up from among his fellows, and bring him to an inner room. Then take the flesh of oil and pour it on his head and say, 'Thus says Adonai, I have anointed you king over Israel.' Then open the doors and flee. Don't wait around." So the young man, a young prophet, went to Ramoth Gilead. Now when he arrived, behold, the army commanders were sitting. So he said, "I have a word for you, commander." Jehu asked, "For which one of us?" He replied, "For you, commander." Then he rose and went inside the house, and the prophet poured the oil on his head and said to him, "Thus says Adonai, God of Israel, I have anointed you king over the people of Adonai over Israel. So you will strike down the house of Ahab your master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of Adonai shed by Jezebel. For the whole house of Ahab will perish, and I will cut off from Ahab every male, slave or free, in Israel. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasah, son of Ahijah. The dogs will eat Jezebel in the field of Jezreel, and there will be none to bury her." Then he opened the door and fled. Then Jehu came out to the officers of his masters, and one asked him, "Is everything all right? Why did this crazy fellow come to you?" He said to them, "Behold," he said to them, "You know the man and his babbling." But they said, "It's a lie. Tell us now." So he said something like this to me, saying, "Thus says Adonai, I have anointed you king over Israel." They hurried, and Then they hurried, and every man took his garment and put it under him on the bare steps, and blew the shofar, saying, "Jehu is king." So Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram. Now Joram had been defending Ramoth Gilead, he and all Israel, against King Hazael of Aram. But King Joram had returned to Jezreel to recover from the wounds that the Arameans had inflicted on him when they fought with King Hazael of Aram. Then Jehu said, "If this is your wish, then let no one escape and go out of the city and go to tell the news in Jezreel." So Jehu mounted a chariot and went to Jezreel, for Joram was lying there. Meanwhile, King Ahaziah of Judah came down to see Joram. Now the watchman stationed on the tower in Jezreel saw Jehub's troops approaching, and said, "I am seeing a troop." Then Joram said, "Take a horseman and dispatch him to meet them, and let him ask, 'Is it peace?'" So the horse rider went to meet him, and said, "Thus says the king, 'Is it peace?'" But Jehu said, "What do you have to do with peace? Turn behind me." So the watchman reported, saying, "The messenger reached them, but didn't come back." Then he dispatched out another horseman, who went to meet them, and said, "Thus says the king, 'Is it peace?'" But Jehu answered, "What do you have to do with peace? Turn behind me." So the watchman reported, saying, "He reached them, but he didn't come back. And the driving is like the driving of Jehu, son of Nimshi, for he is driving on like a maniac." Then Joram ordered, "Hitch up the chariot." So he hitched up his chariot. Then King Joram of Israel and King Ahaziah of Judah went out, each in his chariot, to meet Jehu, and found him at the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. Now when Joram saw Jehu, he asked, "Is it peace, Jehu?" So he answered, "What peace, so long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many. So Joram turned his horses around and fled, crying out to Ahaziah, Treason, Ahaziah! But Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and shot Joram between his arms, and the arrow went out through his heart, and he collapsed in his chariot. Then he said to Bidkar, his aide, Pick him up and throw him on the property of the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. Remember how you and I were riding together behind Ahab, his father, when Adonai took up this burden against him. As surely as I have seen the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons yesterday, it is a declaration of Adonai. I will repay you on this property. It is a declaration of Adonai. So now, pick him up and throw him onto the property, just as in the word of Adonai. When King Ahaziah of Judah saw this, he fled by way of the garden house, but Jehu pursued him and said, Shoot him too. They shot him in the chariot at Gur Pass, Gur Pass, near Iblim. Then he fled to Megiddo, but he died there. Then his servants carried him in a chariot to Jerusalem and buried him in his tomb with his fathers in the city of David. Ahaziah had become king over Judah in the 11th year of Joram the son of Ahab. Now when Jehu arrived at Jezreel, Jezebel heard about it. So she painted her eyes and dressed her hair and looked out the window. As Jehu entered the gate, she said, Is it peace, Zimri, your master's assassin? Then he lifted up his face to the window and called out, Who is on my side? Who? 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down toward him. Then he said, Throw her down. So they threw her down. Then her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled her. Then he went inside, ate and drank. Then he said, Attend now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she was a king's daughter. But when they went to bury her, they found no more of her than the skull, the feet, and the palms of her hands. So they came back and told him, and he said, This is the word of Adonai, which he spoke of his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, In the field of Jezreel will the dogs eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the carcass of Jezebel will be as dung upon the face of the field of the property of Jezreel, so that they will not say, This was Jezebel. And that is the end of chapter 9. And we're going to come back with another part. I'm going to cut this off a little bit sooner than what I have been. We've got chapter 10, 11, and 12. So I will be back with the next part beginning chapter 10.